for tuning into this broadcast of the state of the economy. Back in March or the beginning March, Citi and Dr. Samiran Chakraborty wrote a note, which was, well, at that point of time, aptly titled Evaluating the Risks of Weather Shocks, Heat Waves, and El Nino. We are adding to the mix the to and fro around monsoons as well in India, and getting in Dr. Samiran Chakraborty to talk about how does he see the weather shocks and the impact of those, maybe on rural growth as well as on inflation. Samiran, great having you. Thank you so much for taking the time out and being with us. What do you make? I mean, okay, first let me just get the recent elephant out of the way, if you will. Skymet yesterday said we are going to be subnormal. IMD comes out and says today that we are normal. Did the Skymet or the IMD or the conflict thereof raise an eyebrow for you at all, or the monsoons didn't really, the monsoon forecasts haven't really troubled you thus far?
Thanks, Neeraj, for having me on your show. And, monsoon is a very important annual event which all of us have to track, despite the fact that we have now a much better irrigated system, etc. Still, there is a focus of the markets on the monsoon. There are 2-3 different ways to look at these forecasts. One is that we had a series of years on which the rainfall has been in that normal range. So there is always that fear that is it that year when finally this trend will be broken and we will have either below normal or excessive rainfall. So that's why probably people are looking at the forecast closely. Having said that, it is also true that it's a lot early to make these forecasts. We are seeing, even in the last few years, that the rainfall pattern is shifting a bit. The monsoon has a delayed start often, and then in the latter part of the year, it catches up, or there is excess rainfall in the month of October. And what we also track is that the kind of El Nino versus La Nina predictions that come out from different global forecasters. So just to share with you, the Australian Meteorological Department, which has some sort of, if you may call it, El Nino versus La Nina index, that was clearly in La Nina territory till a few days back, but now has moved into neutral territory. It has not yet moved into El Nino, whereas some American agencies are already talking about El Nino. What our studies find is that unless El Nino prevails in India in that April to June period, any forecast for El Nino before that period, that does not have much impact for us. So let's see whether in this next 3 months, how this global forecasters, they change their position on El Nino or not, because that will have material bearing on things.
Got it. So in some sense, since we are on April 11th today, it's way too soon to your mind to try and start contemplating or pontificating over the effects of El Nino, because it may not even be that kind of a year, because it's too early to predict it from an India vantage point.
Absolutely. So the global El Nino years and the so-called India El Nino years, they don't often coincide. We define India El Nino years as the year when between April to June, there is El Nino in India, or it is between the September to November period. So either in April to June or September, November, you can call it India El Nino year. If there is an El Nino India year, then there is almost a 85% probability, by going by historic precedents, of having a bad agriculture production year and consequently impact on food inflation.
Got it. Now, since we are on that topic, I'm just asking you a follow-up there. While I take on board the point that it may not be a concern because it's too early to predict, should it be an El Nino year for India, Samiran? I read your note of March 2nd, wherein you've spoken about how past instances are something to learn from about the impact that an El Nino event can have on India. Can you just talk about it? I start off by saying that we don't know it as yet, but should it were to happen, what could happen?
So we have had from 1956 onward about 16 such instances of India-specific El Nino years, where El Nino persisted in that April to June or September to November period. And out of those 16 episodes, in 13 of them, we have seen agricultural production declining year over year. And if you take a shorter history from the mid 1980s, then we have had 7 such instances of El Nino, and in 6 of them, we had seen at the wholesale price level food grain inflation to increase year over year. So both from a food grain production perspective as well as from a food inflation perspective, uh, the risk of uh, a shock, negative shock, is quite acute if it is an El Nino year.
Could it get exacerbated in a year like this, wherein if there is an El Nino effect, it is preceded by severe heat waves of which have and unseasonal rains, which have already troubled, I presume, some bit of crop patterns and production.
Yes, I mean, whatever we understand is that this year the heat wave had less of a damage, partly because the way the wheat crop behaves, a March heat wave is more harmful than a February heat wave. So maybe if heat wave had less impact, but we are still assessing the impact of the unseasonal rains. Clearly, in certain parts of the country, the Punjab government has kind of indicated that maybe close to 40% of the cultivated land had some sort of damage from unseasonal rains and hailstorms. So we'll have to see that the estimate that the government has of procuring about 34 lakh metric tons of wheat this year compared to 18 million ton last year. To what extent this 34 million ton target is being met uh, given the unseasonal rains impact. Now, why this has become suddenly more important than usual is that the food grain stock, particularly the wheat stock, is at a very low level. So, because we don't have that sort of a buffer stock, this was a year, given how the sowing had been, the hope was that we'll be able to build up on that buffer stock, which will see us through all of the next year. Now, what has happened is that in anticipation of a good crop, the government has sold in open market in February and early March. That has depressed wholesale wheat prices significantly. But because the government has sold, the buffer stock has come down even further. So if the unseasonal rains have impacted crops and the government is unable to get the 34 lakh metric tons of wheat procured, then over an extended period, this elevated price pressures can come back, especially if it is also a El Nino year. So I think all of these things have to be looked at in conjunction, not just the weather pattern, but also the fact that the food grain buffer stock is low. And we are entering this period on the back of a very elevated wheat price inflation to start with.
Mm. Okay, so Samir, in that note that I'm referring to, written by you and your colleague, you've spoken about two things, which is the severity of the weather shocks and the government's ability to intervene. Now, the weather shock, I reckon, is still wait and watch. And therefore, my question is, do you reckon, I mean, the government has done some things already. Do you reckon that in its arsenal, for wheat or otherwise, the government has enough room to be able to intervene to cushion the impact of a major weather-led shock on wheat or any of the other key agricultural produce which may contribute to inflation? Already, I believe we are hearing sound bites of prohibiting or reducing the limits of sugar exports by virtue of the fact that there's been a damage of crop in Maharashtra, if I'm not wrong, due to unseasonal rains. So, what is your thought on this?
So already the government has intervened quite effectively in the wheat market. So if you see the wholesale wheat prices have almost collapsed 25 to 30% between end January till now because of that intervention of about open market sales of about 3 lakh metric tons that I was talking about before. Now, using these measures like stock holding, etc., these stock holding limits, etc., these obviously have some short-term effect, but this can only address the speculative element of the problem. If there is a core demand-supply imbalance, it can't solve that issue. To address that problem, the country needs to then import. And the ability to import is function of two things. One is that the global supply will have to be in excess. And second is that adjusting for import duties, it should be cheaper to import than buying it at home. If these two conditions are satisfied, then technically allowing more imports could bridge the demand supply gap. And to that extent, the problem can be addressed. And this is not just about just wheat or sugar. Even for a commodity like milk, where prices have gone up quite significantly, we are now considering import of milk. At least I have not heard of, in my experience before, of significant milk imports in this country. So that's happening because at the current price dynamics and global demand supply dynamics, it's probably making sense for allowing some amount of milk imports. So if these two conditions are satisfied, then importing these products could be a possibility. We have to understand that globally food prices are actually coming off. It has been almost more than a year now that the FAO food price index has been on a consistent decline from the peak that happened after the Ukraine war. So that way, that optionality is there with the government to intervene and do more of import and reduce the pressures domestically.
Got it. So, Samiran, please correct me if I'm wrong, but with the presumption that the past weather shocks that we've seen have largely had a minimal impact and the government is able to cushion some of these. So, therefore, the eye is on whether there is a future weather shock in terms of El Nino, in terms of how monsoon actually unravels, and the government's ability to intervene. If both of the if the monsoon is normal and if we by and large don't have a very large El Nino impact, then you reckon that the adverse impact of agricultural prices, supply-led inflation might be minimal. Would that be a fair assessment?
I think I'll just add one small thing that in the near term, that wheat procurement issue, where the government is planning about 34 million tons of wheat purchase to fill up the buffer stock. This, what the final number ends up to be, will also be quite closely watched. And that will be a function of how much damage has happened because of the unseasonal rains in March. At least to me, this is an unknown that how this is going to play out. But after that, it will spill over into how the El Nino or not affect the monsoon. Beyond that, I think our general forecast is of barring one or two items like sugar and milk, on rest of the stuff, things should be relatively well contained.
Which is good to know. In which case, may I ask you what could the possible dangers or inflationary pressures be like? I mean, could it be imported inflation or global inflation led by maybe a less than potent recession in US, and one hope that's happened because we need growth, or a China-led demand side inflation, or for that matter, if indeed weather gods play nasty, then on the supply side and the agriculture side, which we're saying for now, aside of milk and wheat, doesn't seem to be too high a probability. What worries you about inflation for the next, say, 8 months?
So the first point is that while global demand is slowing down, the open question is that whether global supply is slowing down even more than global demand. Especially, see, if you think of a commodity like oil, where the producers, the OPEC, is having significant production cuts. And after the production cuts, the demand supply balance is not as good as was thought to be. And that can put pressure on oil prices if on top of it, the US government tries to build up on their strategic petroleum reserves, then that can add on to demand and put further pressure on oil prices. And in general, a lot of other commodity prices which are connected to oil, in general, the whole energy complex, that can have a adverse effect on Indian inflation too. Uh, the second aspect is that while we are positive on Chinese growth, is this growth going to be more driven by more demand for goods or more demand for services? At this point, it looks like it's going to be more services than goods. But what if we are wrong and the Chinese goods demand also starts picking up? Chinese real estate recovers, Chinese infrastructure picks up again. All those things can create further demand for commodities and give a fillip to commodity prices, which will be inflationary for India. And the last thing that I worry about is that to what extent inflation, not just in the global context, but in India also, has become deeply entrenched in through inflation expectations, etc. The Our studies show that inflation expectations on a structural basis might have gone up by about 100 basis points. That would probably mean that we don't get back to that 4% medium-term target in a hurry. We stay closer to 5. Now, is 5 a bad number? Maybe not, given how global inflation has been. But if we're really serious about getting down to 4, then maybe more policy action will be needed both on monetary and fiscal side.
Got it. Okay. So it seems to be, Samiran, before my final question, that it seems to be a wait and watch approach from your end at least, because a lot of factors, it might not be the right time to assess the impact of those. So wait and watch and hope for the best. That seems to be the mantra currently.
I mean, we live in a very volatile world today with a lot of event risks around us. So it's difficult to thumb the table and really say that we can have a lot of predictability on the future path of either inflation or growth. This is one of those times. But it's also true that we have to sort of differentiate between the wheat and the chaff. There are some structural elements to inflation, and then there are some noisy elements around it. So that's where I was pointing to this 100 basis point higher inflation expectations, which is almost like a structural element. And all these El Nino weather shocks, everything are more like noisy elements around it.
Got it. My final question, I just saved it for the last because I wanted to understand from you, because there's a positive angle to it. There is a belief amongst a lot of, say, your peer set as well, that quite unlike what happened in 2022, 2023 could be a year wherein rural growth might actually be stronger. Now, my question to you, I mean, it could be led because of infrastructure as a proportion of the balance sheet and the kind of spend that the government will do, so on and so forth, whatever. But rural demand or rural growth will come back. My question is, do you believe in that, one? And if that were to happen, could it be inflationary in a sense that we haven't seen that kind of a problem or an impact in the last 6 to 12 odd months, so to say, and that might add a little bit of fuel to the inflation fire?
So it's a very important topic, and we wrote a note on this in November 2022, where we first time said that there is a possibility that our rural demand index can flip and start looking better than the urban demand index. We did not say that this will happen immediately. We said it can happen with a slight lag, but there are now some signs of that. From there on, the rural demand has improved. In particular, what has caught our attention is the sequential momentum in rural wage growth, both for rural farm wage growth as well as rural non-farm wage growth. The momentum is running close to double digits now. That's good news. Rural employment has also improved. And as you were mentioning, that certain kinds of rural construction activity has also gone up, more so on rural housing, less on rural roads. Rural roads is still lagging a little bit. And on top of it, this is getting reflected in, say, Narega employment numbers, where for the first time after COVID, the Narega numbers, the Narega job demand numbers have fallen below COVID level, below pre-COVID levels. So that is a sign that rural has less stress, because in a stressful environment in rural, the Narega demand generally goes up. While some of my peer group was a bit disappointed that the budget was not as much rural focused, what I think people are missing out is that even if the delta was not very significant compared to FY23 and FY24 in the total spending to rural, but if I compare that number, in our view, that number X of all sorts of subsidies is about 1.8% of GDP now. That is almost 50 basis points of GDP higher than what it used to be pre-COVID. So at a level sense, that level is still significantly high, and this is X of subsidies. So if we are not looking at the delta, but at the level, then I think the public spending in rural is also going to be a supportive factor. What I worry about a little is the quality of jobs in rural. By our understanding, the nature of jobs that are getting created in rural is not the better quality jobs, and more the construction sort of jobs or self-employment kind of jobs, which might mean some dampening effect on demand. But if we start seeing the quality of jobs improving, then I think I would be much more comfortable on a full-fledged rural recovery. And as we discussed in our early part of the conversation, that the weather pattern and its impact on agriculture would be very important. Rural is a very circular economy. If agriculture starts doing well, then the non-agricultural part also starts benefiting out of it.
Got it. Dr. Samiran Chakraborty, this was lovely talking to you on all aspects, and thank you for allaying the quote-unquote fears around the monsoon predictions and the impact thereof. It was too early to call it today right now. Thanks, Dr. Chakraborty, for joining us today.
Thank you, Neeraj. Thanks for the
pleasure was ours, and viewers, thanks for tuning in to this broadcast of the State of the Economy.